Okay, within biometrics, again, social acceptability is definitely a big issue. And this is basically something just numerically you will need to know. You need to know the difference between type 1 and type 2 error. And basically the whole issue is you want to get to the crossover error rate. So in the commercial world, they want to minimize both the false positives and the false negatives. So basically biometric reads and reviews very detailed information, and the greater the detail involved, the greater chance for errors in the authentication process. Again, the type 1 rejects authorized individuals. And this is going to be a false rejection rate, or FRR, and that's type 1. Type 2 is the FAR, which is false acceptance rate. I know a lot of environments go the opposite way, and they want basically the false positives. Basically, they do not want bad guys getting into the area, so they don't care if there's, let's say, 10 false negatives. They just do not want the false positive. But for especially a test on the commercial side, they want to minimize the probability of false positive versus false negative, and that crossover error rate is the very biggest number that you need to take in consideration. And you want to get that number as low as possible. The lower the number where they cross over, the better the biometrics. So that's the CIR's, or CER, crossover error rate. These are the types of biometrics. You have your fingerprint, which is ridge endings, and basically in that area there's finger scan, same as fingerprint, but extracting a smaller amount of data. There's the palm scan, which is all prints from fingers and creases, ridges, and so forth. There's the hand geometry, which is shape, length of hand, and fingers as well. There's the retina, which is the blood vessels pattern in the back of the eyeball. And again, that's why sometimes on the older ones it actually had a puff to where it can make sure that you have enough wide area to look at the blood vessels in the back. And again, that does change over time, so that's something. There's iris, which is the colored portion surrounding the pupil. Signature dynamics captures electrical signals in the signature process. When would that be a potential issue with signature dynamics? What was that?
As you get older, your signature might change.
As far as the electronic side, a lot of times too with signature dynamics, they'll even be doing that in keyboard dynamics as well, such as when somebody types in their password. So you can have the same exact password, but sometimes when people type it in, they have a specific pattern they do. For example, an 8-character password, they may do the first 4 characters and the next 4 characters because it's on the other side of the keyboard or just the way they do it. So if you have the same password and if you don't do the same rhythmic generation, then you're not going to be able to authenticate through the system. Password characteristics. In this area, this is of course the least secure and it's the cheapest because you have a database of, okay, what's the password? A lot of the databases, this is the beautiful thing, they're clear text. So if you get into the database, you can get the password relatively easy. Then you have a lot of the databases, like the online systems. They'll have it to where they store the passwords in MD5 hashes. So still with an MD5 hash, there's a rainbow table out there that has up to 8 characters, and you can crack the majority of 8-character passwords in any MD5 hash. So again, that's not the most secure, but it adds another layer of security. So you're going to basically make it to where if anybody gets access to the database through SQL injection or physical access or whatnot, it's the basic 80-20 rule. 80% of the people aren't going to be able to crack in. Then you have your other 20% that are more sophisticated that will then go forward. Again, that goes to your defense in depth. The little things in life make things either interesting or more difficult for the attackers. And with passwords, users a lot of times choose easy ones, usually full words. A lot of times they will choose something that's close to them. Birthdays, especially if it's a PIN. PIN numbers a lot of times are birthdays of either their birthday, their kid's birthday, the parent's birthday, things like that. So if you know in that aspect, and that's another fun thing, if you're trying to brute force somebody's PIN number, usually you want to start off with what the years are going to be. For example, like 1957. So 1 and 9 are popular ones to start off with. Possibly start off with a month. So 0s and 1s are some of your more common characters that people will use as a PIN number. Also share passwords. I've seen some scenarios to where there'd be a local administrator account. And within this local administrator account, you'd have your core group of administrators that all know the password and the username. And then one case I had, actually a forensics issue, there was inappropriate use happening in a conference room. And what ended up happening was somebody was using the local administrator account. And further research comes to find out that a lot of the local administrators just didn't want to get out of their desks or out of their cubicle, so they were giving the local username and password to individuals that wanted to install software that was probably not authorized in the network in the first place. So instead of that core 5 having the SID 500 or the big account, you had literally hundreds of people doing it. So sharing passwords is really bad, because then you no longer have accountability for any actions done with that user account. Writing down passwords, this is also fun. Again, back to the sticky notes. And then if you have proprietary software, for example, a lot of bookkeepers may have QuickBooks or Great Plains or whatnot. If they have a password, a lot of them will put the software password in the software manual. So usually they'll write it down either in a sticky note or in the manual in the first few pages, the first or last few pages. So if you're doing from an attacker's standpoint or a pen test, take all the manuals that you can if you get physical access to the area, because a lot of times they may have good, interesting content. A lot of people do not change passwords. This is great because a lot of areas will have a 30-day to 90-day policy, but they have their development network on the same physical network as the rest of their systems. And the development network, or the development systems, don't follow the same security standards as the rest of the network. So they will have the same username and password for a user, but basically it never dies. So they don't change it every 90 days. And then a lot of them will have very weak passwords, such as like some of the SQL databases, SA for the username, and SA for the password, or password for the password, or test for the password. So a lot of times they won't change it, and they're very weak, especially in testbed environments. Then, of course, you have your shoulder surfing. There was a question in the practice test that said which is the least acceptable. And this shoulder surfing is a social engineering attack. But if somebody knows you're behind them, then basically it's a psychological issue to where a lot of people don't like typing in their password because they know that you're watching. So that's the whole thing where it's least acceptable, because dumpster diving, nobody sees you. And then if you misrepresent yourself, then you're trying to get them to give information to you, but they still trust you. But nobody really trusts anybody standing right behind them, no matter who they are. Password generators. These are the fun ones. I've been in many scenarios where people do password generators, then give your temporary password over the either temporary or permanent password over either email, phone, or whatnot, and almost guaranteed password generators or passwords generated by these things will be written down, because people are going to have a hard time remembering the special characters interlaced with what's uppercase, lowercase, what's a number, and so forth. So the more complex a password you get, the more likely it is to be written down. And then again, with passphrases, they're probably not going to be password generators, because nobody's really going to remember 20 characters of garbled up garbage. So what they'll end up doing is start use words, and then probably switch the A's with @ signs, the I's with ones, and so forth. And people are generally lazy as well for passwords. At your 30 or 90 days, let's say if you have a relatively strong password, it's 14, 15, 16 characters long. A lot of people, instead of changing the password completely, will either put a 1 at the end of it, or a number, or they'll put an exclamation point at the end of it. So basically they'll have the same password, they'll just add a character or change one character within the same one so they can remember it. And another fun thing about passwords, people generally have multiple accounts. So if they have 20 accounts, sometimes the usernames are going to be the same. Chances are, to the 20 accounts, the password that you're able to crack is going to be good for multiple other accounts within the system or within whatever they have, especially on the web or whatnot. So if you're able to crack one, chances are you've just cracked several others. Okay, password shoulds. Again, depending on the OS, but on a regular password should be at least 8 characters, because 8 characters is going to be harder to crack than 7. If it's Windows and LM hashes, it should be 15 characters or higher, because if it's 14 characters or lower, basically it's broken down into 2 7-character strings, and then you're cracking both sides of the password. So you can crack only one side of the password and then still have the other one uncracked, but if it's a word, sometimes you can brute force it or guess it offline as well. One of the biggest issues with, again back with LM, if you have the rainbow tables, 65 gig, you have a 0.999% chance of, or you have a 99.9% chance of actually getting it. So with that being said, you always want to do the no LM hash, but for the test, definitely you want the bigger the better. Alphanumerics and symbols, you do not want to just stick with what's in a dictionary. So that's another thing. For example, if you use the basic one, test 1, chances are that's going to be cracked because test 1 is probably in a dictionary somewhere, probably in many different dictionaries, especially if they do hybrid attacks. Test is probably there, and the hybrid attack is just going to brute force the end of that password and then the beginning of the password. Then use non-dictionary words. And like I mentioned before, the SSET is usually a non-dictionary character. So a lot of the password crackers will not be using that because they'll just be using the basic American character set. Also depends on what country that they're attacking from, but in general, the majority of the brute forcers, the dictionaries, the majority of the rainbow tables that are out there freely available are focusing more on English character sets and English words. Password history. A lot of times the passwords, like I mentioned before, they just change the password a little bit by changing the @ sign, maybe to an A or to something completely different. One thing that you will also see is that some people try to prevent that. So if they have, let's say, 5 characters that are the same in one password to the next password, they won't allow that to go forward. And then some people even have it to where you can't use the same password in the last 20 tries. So there are ways to get around that. But the majority of organizations that I've seen have it to where it may be 3 tries, you can't use the same password, and then you can use it the 4th time. But people usually have the same password, just altered slightly. Clipping level. Basically mean the 3 strikes you're out type scenario, or however many you want to do it. Sometimes they completely disable the account, then you have to call the administrator or tech support to get it re-enabled. A lot of support doesn't want to deal with that, so what they end up doing is the, let's say, 5, 10, 15-minute timeout. So once you do 3 strikes, then wait 15 minutes, because that's going to basically make it to where the users are going to get trained for that, and they're no longer going to generate tech support calls. And from a business perspective, that saves money, and same thing from the tech support perspective. Okay, audit logs. There's, of course, time, date, user ID, or personal accountability. Because in theory, only that individual should be able to log in to that account. And also computer logged in from and operations carried out. Definitely important to deal with when using usernames and passwords and so forth. And the issue with that is if somebody's sniffing, if you know a person does not have physical access to another computer further down the network, or if it was shown and proven that they were in their cube the whole time and another computer logged in as them, then anything done with that is not going to be accountable or held liable for that those actions. One issue in computer forensics that is a big problem is the "it wasn't me" defense. So if anybody gets accused of anything, they say it wasn't me, then it comes down to not only everything that happened during that time period, you have to prove was tied to that specific user account. You have to prove that that user had the capabilities. So either A, they were in the cubicle at the time. You could use that through either witnesses or potential like CCTVs that they're in the building. Because a lot of people say, that wasn't me, I was at lunch, I was 5 miles from there. And if they do use that, then you have to prove that they were not 5 miles, they're actually within the area. Because somebody could have actually compromised the account. Okay, the different password attacks. Of course, there's a dictionary. It uses a big long list of potential passwords, hashes them, and then compares the hash with the password. Brute force tries all possibilities and then basically hashes those and then uses the hash that you have, and then basically tries to find the password. And this right here, this is LoftCrack. How many people have used or have heard of LoftCrack before? LoftCrack basically was built by Loft Heavy Industries back in the 90s. Used to be a hacking group that was their pride and joy. Then they made a company called @Stake. @Stake was basically a pen testing or an ethical hacking company. Security services company that was then bought out by Symantec. During that process, Symantec now owns LoftCrack code, but they end-of-lifed it. So you can't really buy any licenses, at least as of this time. It's been that way for about a year and a half or so. But they're at Loft 5. And LC5 is pretty good because it does the sniffing, and you can also do remote password cracking. If you want to do faster cracking, there's John the Ripper, which is a command line utility. And then also there's a patch for John the Ripper that will allow you to do distributed cracking on passwords. So it's distributed grid computing. So you can put it on multiple different systems and then basically send portions or different sections over and basically have it attack the password. Makes things a lot faster when multiple things are working on it. Okay, countermeasures for password cracking. Increased password protection, such as using cracking tools against your own accounts. So use LoftCrack, see if you can crack it, because that's the same type of thing that they're going to be using. Same thing with John the Ripper. Basically do PW dump, grab all the user accounts of the SAM on a Windows system or try to get the shadow, and then just try to crack them. Because if you can crack passwords in, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes, so can they. If it takes you, let's say, 3 months to crack 80% of your passwords, then that may be acceptable if you have to change your passwords every 30 days. But the whole point of it is, if you're going through, say, 10,000 user accounts or 1,000 user accounts, and if you can crack any of them within the first couple hours, chances are they're not up to password policy, so they need to be changed immediately. Also use password advisors, such as the software for strong passwords and users. But the issue is, again, with these, the more complex the password, the more likely or it is probable that they will be writing it down somewhere. So again, if you increase it to a larger amount, chances are they're going to be able to memorize it easier. Passphrases are easier to remember than basic passwords. So you can get to a specific point. For example, if a password is going to be larger than 12 characters, it may be easier for the individual to memorize than a password that's only 8 characters. The challenge is, again, that it's going to have words and whatnot, so it's going to minimize the probability or the probable characters whenever you're attacking it, because then you're doing a dictionary hybrid attack. But I have seen stats or whatnot where people can remember a 16-character password easier than they can remember an 8-character password with a strong password advisor. Okay, also encrypt password files. Again, I've seen a lot of scenarios to where both on Unix and Windows boxes, specific pieces of software would have the username and password not really hard-coded in there, but within like an INI file or a config file, to where whenever it runs it, anybody can see it. And the fun thing too is people that would have text files and then of course put their usernames and passwords in these text files. How many people know what salting is? Basically a salt value. Windows NT has a salt value for their passwords. So what they end up doing is they hash the passwords, for example, like an NTLM or even an LM. And then they'll have another key that is like the bootsys key, which is going to be your salt value. What that ends up doing is it is a secondary hash that they rehash the hashes of your passwords. So basically they double hash your passwords, but the difference is that boot key is a special hash for that either user or that environment to make it to where you have to dehash using that boot key first before you can then crack the passwords. So it makes it a lot more complicated for the attacker to get the info. Okay, also do not pass passwords in clear text during transmission. As a lot of you have probably seen with that POP, had the user account password, definitely in clear text. You also have SMTP if you have to do any sort of authentication. FTP, clear text. Telnet, of course, clear text. So the only way to get around to that when doing the transmission in that aspect is either use like SSH or communicate through HTTPS. There are ways to bypass some of those, especially if you fake the certificates, but especially for the test is concerned, encryption is the best way to protect yourself because it prevents man in the middle and sniffing. Okay, also greatly protect your central location where your passwords are kept. If you have a centralized area that has all your passwords, if somebody is able to compromise that, now they have all your passwords. Again, with the boxes being only as secure as they physically are and basically technically are, if somebody gets physical access to a system, they own the box. 9 out of 10 times, depending on if you have hard disk encryption and so forth. If a server has all the usernames and passwords, for example, like Active Directory, if somebody is able to get to the Active Directory system, dump all the files, they can still crack them offline later on. So if you secure the centralized system more so than you do any of the others, you're going to minimize the probability that somebody's going to have the opportunity to get the passwords. Okay, cognitive passwords. These are things that, again, they keep it's the 80-20 rule. is because the 20%, the people that could get through here, are going to basically do the research and then find out where the person went to school, went to high school, if they got married, what town they got married, or multiple times what towns they got married in, their dog's name, their kid's name, things like that. But usually this is based on fact or opinion based, used to validate a person's identity. I know for a lot of things they'll say, what's your favorite cartoon character? And if they have, for example, like a MySpace page or a Facebook page or a blog, sometimes you can go to their personal websites or whatnot and see specific characteristics. And if they only have one cartoon character up there, there's a good possibility that's their favorite one. Also, mother's maiden name, again, just doing your research, you'll be able to find out through family trees what that's going to be. A year graduated from school, again, a lot of times they'll have it on LinkedIn, on their resume, the resumes being a monster, dice, and so forth. Third grade teacher's name, a little research, this is probably going to be a little bit harder, but you can find out what school they were and then just do chronological. Favorite color, and also hard to compromise and easier for the user to remember. And that's, I have seen a lot of cases, even happen to me, where I couldn't remember the cognitive password that I put in there. Then spelling also is an issue. Okay, one-time password characteristics. These are dynamic passwords generated for one-time use only, protects against replay attacks. Also, a token device or software can generate one-time passwords. A lot of times you'll have an actual device like a USB device or some other device, you push a button, gives you a number, and you put that number in as a PIN. A lot of scenarios. I know an individual, basically what ended up happening is they were doing a lot of the online stock trading. And somebody hacked into the account or somehow started messing with the account and sold all the stock, and then it went elsewhere. So the individual called up and said, that wasn't me. And the organization was gracious enough to say, it wasn't you. We'll now credit you all the stuff that was transferred. But what we're going to do now, because it wasn't that much, we're going to send you a USB key with a one-time pad. So basically, from that point on, nobody could state that their ID was used nefariously. The only attack that could happen from then on is going to be somebody attacks the actual server as opposed to the user account. So, but again, it was really nice. They had the button on it, and it synchronized with the server. But they had to put their username, their password, and then the ID number or the actual characters that were on that pad, and then put it in there. So now it has to go through a 3-step rule. And it changes every minute. So if you don't type it in fast enough, then you have to re-authenticate or basically send it in. I know a lot of organizations are trying to go that route, but it does get pretty pricey per individual if you don't know that the individual is going to be with you for, say, more than 6-month period of time or whatnot. So a lot of organizations are only doing it to people that have had, for example, a tenure with them, that have been there for 2-3 years or whatnot, and then giving it to them. Okay, good old synchronous tokens. You have your token device characteristics. Token device and authentication services are synchronized, basically time or event. Again, if you don't have the USB connection or any way for the device to connect to a computer or to the server, it's usually a timed event. So you hit the button, it gives you a specific number, and then there's a same timing sequence on the server. The problem is let's say, for example, if the battery starts becoming a little bit less, the timing is going to be off. So when the battery dies, the device goes out completely, there's a good probability the device is going to expire. So you just have to redo the device or resynchronize the device. Okay, the device generates a password, which is then displayed to the user. User types in the value of the identification data in the login screen. One-time password is part of the credential set used to authenticate on the server. And the authentication server is then expecting a specific value, which is from that key. Again, a lot of times it will be time sensitive. So whenever you go through there, and if it takes you longer than a minute to type it in, now you can no longer validate because the number's changed. Okay, asynchronous one-time password generators. Based on a challenge response mechanism. Random value is set in the authentication server for the user. User enters the value into the token device. The token device hashes or encrypts the value and provides the results to the user. User then uses the result as a one-time password and sends it to the authentication server.
So like those little cards that RSA had, the matrix on it?
Yeah, they have one.
Challenge response, and you have to
And then I know some of them are actually USBs that you put in, and then basically the challenge response is done for you. And then you hit the button, so that whole process, you don't have to interact with it, and then it just comes up with the number as well. But yeah. And then, of course, there's the good old the paper way of doing it, to where they have the card, and then somebody sends in a specific keyword, then you find out what matches with the keyword, you send another keyword back, and it basically the cards will be switched, let's say every 24-hour period of time. So yeah, it's an old school way of doing it. But okay, cryptographic keys. Basic authentication through cryptographic mechanisms. There's asymmetric keys. These are used for authentication of some implementations, such as private key or digital signature. Does everybody understand the difference between, for example, like asymmetric and symmetric cryptography? We will cover that in more detail in another chapter as well, but symmetric is basically you have the same key to encrypt and decrypt, and everybody has that same key. It is by far the fastest out of the two, but it's also a lot less secure because you're basically focusing on the security of the key or the key storage. So if anyone basically loses that key or that key is compromised, the whole communications path is now compromised. With asymmetric, it uses public key and private key cryptography. So if your, for example, private key is compromised, only communications to your node or your individual will be compromised. Again, it's going to be a lot slower, but it's a lot more secure because each individual node has their own private key. And the way to memorize it, because you basically every security test you're going to come across is probably going to have this type of question on it. But for example, the difference between encrypting and digital signatures. When you're signing something, you're using both of your keys. You're using your private key to sign it. They are validating it with your public key. So signing is both, it's all your side, or your keys. If you're encrypting it, you grab their public key and then they decrypt it with their private key. So encryption are both of their keys, signing it is both of your keys. So, okay, asymmetric, could do a digital signature, again, which is probably going to be your private key, and then they have some sort of public key. There's also no secret information has been shared between the entities. And a challenge can be sent to the user, which is encrypted with her private key for authentication. One thing to really push as far as this is concerned, HTTPS. A lot of people think that that's asynchronous cryptography because it uses a public key type scenario, but it's actually both. It uses asymmetric cryptography, then does the key exchange through asymmetric cryptography, and then becomes symmetric. So basically the server then sends the symmetric key over to the client through the asymmetric connection. So it does use the public key and so forth to get the data to them, but then it goes to the everybody has the same key encryption. Okay, passphrase is usually longer than passwords, provides more protection. It's harder to guess. And then also passphrase is converted into virtual password. The virtual password is then used within the software for authentication. Again, the nice thing about the passphrase, if it's 15 characters or longer, it's automatically going to break the NTLM password issue with Windows. So it's no longer going to be able to be stored into the weaker hash set. It's going to force it into the NTLM. Okay, memory cards. Memory card characteristics, usually a magnetic strip that holds data and cannot be or cannot process data because it just holds the data. And there's usually 4 layers, so I guess depending on the reader, depending on where the head's going to be, there's several things that you can put on this item. Basically a magnetic strip that holds data. Anyone with a reader can view the data held on the strip if not encrypted. No microprocessor is going to be on this thing because it's going to be a smart card if it's a microprocessor. Proximity cards, credit cards, ATM cards, a lot have these. And then basically the added costs compared to other authentication technologies because you have to actually purchase the actual card. If a corporation is to do this, again, they have their card reader, the printer. A lot of times they, of course, have a photograph on the item as well. But as far as an attacker perspective, the printers, the readers, and then the writers for the magnetic strip are relatively cheap. And the plastic blanks for the cards themselves are also relatively cheap. I know some individuals will actually get their good old hotel cards and then use these to basically fake ID cards. Still have a picture ID or whatnot, but it's not going to actually be, it maybe just be a printed off picture, but then they'll basically reprint the magnetic information on the back of your hotel swipe card and then still be able to bypass some security features. Okay, smart cards. Smart card characteristics, they have a microprocessor and integrated circuits. I've seen very few commercial places use this as a regular identification card. Most of them are going to be some of the more advanced places or whatnot because it does cost more. I have, however, seen a tire shop in Colorado Springs. It was an international chain, but actually had a smart card for their swipe system. So whenever they put it in their system to see if you purchased how much data or whatnot or how much products, I don't see how that would be financially feasible for most organizations because you can get the same thing from a swipe. But again, you're looking at probably 5 to 10 times more for a swipe card, for a smart card versus a swipe card for a blank. Then because also the reader technology and writer technology is going to be a little bit more as well. The majority of them are tamper-proof. After a threshold of failed login attempts, it can render itself unusable. And you basically just have to go back down and have the card reseeded. There's a PIN or password unlocks smart card functionality. Card could contain things such as biometric data, a response to challenge, holding a private key, holding users' work history, medical information, and so forth. That's again, I have heard future talks about eventually how people want to go to the one document scenario to where everybody has their own smart card, which is going to be basically your driver's license, bank card, pretty much anything and everything for that. Which, of course, if your wallet gets stolen, that means that you're in a world of hurt. Okay, also added costs compared to other authentication technologies. There's reader purchase and so forth. And again, the more technical the mechanism's going to get, of course, the more expensive it's going to get. That's why a lot of people are basically sticking with your swipe cards and proximity cards, even though those are relatively easy to duplicate. Single sign-on, we're also going to cover that, access control models, access control administration, and technologies and methods. Good old single sign-on. The benefit, of course, is the users no longer have to basically log into as many things as they used to. The downside is, if you compromise one, just like asymmetric versus symmetric cryptography, you now have access to everything the user had access to. So there is a potential downside to single sign-on. But this is where users only need to authenticate one time. Basically, then they'll have access to necessary resources. Users only need one credential set. This reduces the administration tasks. And many companies basically try to go after this to minimize not only time, money, databases that they have to secure, but it just makes life better. So sometimes you can even add more security restrictions to an environment as long as you put single sign-on. It could be a trade-off. There's also issues such as credential sets need to be in the correct format in different platforms. There's also security issues. Is once you break the one, you now have access to everything. Okay, scripts is single sign-on technology. Basically, the whole portion of single sign-on is you log in once, then you're logged in everywhere. Which, as mentioned before, you can do a jerry-rigged or basically a piecemeal single sign-on by doing everything scripting. So whenever they sign on to the system, it then uses the username and password that they have for their account and then signs on to other resources as well. Okay, commands and scripts carried out. Most of the time the scripts are going to be in clear text. Chances are they are. A lot of times you'll have hard disk encryption, so if anybody gets a copy of the hard drive, they won't be able to get the scripts. But if they bounce off the person being logged in and they run some sort of application, then they scan all the files on the disk, then they can still get to the username and password. Okay, these are usually held in one central script. There are a lot of security issues there. Okay, directory services in a single sign-on technology. Basically, directory service is a network service that identifies network resources. Service authenticates subjects and authorizes access to resources. This basically allows different security policies to be applied. And also usually a database based on the X500 standard, possibly LDAP type of access capabilities. For example, you also hear like the X509 certificate. Is anybody familiar with that? Basically comes down to your good old digital certificate. The X509 is going to be same thing you can get from VeriSign or Thought, or even if you have your own CA server, it's going to generate a X509 certificate, which is specifically like the public-private key type scenario. Okay, thin clients, or dumb terminals. Systems do not have the necessary instruction set to be a complete operating system. Basically depends on the centralized server or mainframe, and users authenticate to the server or the mainframe one time. And once they're in there, basically it acts as like the operating system is on the system. However, I've seen a lot of people, instead of using the thin clients, they're using the smart clients. It's actually use an actual operating system, or they have a quote-unquote thin client setup where that thin client has its own operating system on it. If that is the case, those are still vulnerable to the same issues as the operating system is vulnerable to. If you have a device that's running, how many people here have heard of WISE before? Or WinTerm or whatnot? For example, WISE, they had several devices that were running a Linux backend, several that were running, for example, like a Windows CE backend. There's still issues that it would be in Windows CE, for example, a driver buffer overflow, that you can attack that individual device, that you may be able to use that device now to jump off and attack other people because it's still running the same code as the regular OS. So sometimes you still have to do the same updates on systems that are running terminal connections as you would a normal OS. I know from an attacker perspective, that's the first thing they look for, is basically anything that could be vulnerable to specific things. Not just the thin-based clients, but equipment. For example, at a hospital, it may be like an MRI machine that may have a 2000 running a lot of things that's going through it. A lot of people will not update those because they fear that the downtime is going to be more expensive than basically the benefit of it. So when it comes down, there's a lot of systems out there that are running equipment that are still vulnerable operating systems from an attacker perspective, but from an administrative perspective, either A, they're not computers because they don't see them as such, because of the mentality mindset, or B, they don't update them because they're afraid that there's going to be excess downtime. Okay, Kerberos, single sign-on technology. Basically, it's a ticket-based authentication protocol designed in the mid-1980s as part of an MIT project, Athena. You're probably not going to need to know that much detail, but it's basically historically why it's there. And also based on symmetric cryptography, not asymmetric. It uses in different flavors of Unix systems for years and currently on a lot of the Windows NT systems. If you are on a Windows 2000 or higher network, and that's basically running the server, and that's all you're running, you can run Kerberos. But if you're running anything less than the 2000 server, so forth, there's a good possibility you may not be able to use Kerberos because it's not really backwards compatible. So it does break a lot of the applications because they're not advanced enough to be able to communicate that way. So that's why Kerberos is not the de facto standard for all Windows NT systems. Okay, Kerberos authentication steps. The client sends a packet or initial package to the Kerberos server, the KDC. It sends a packet back saying, yes, we know who you are. And then the user basically sends another packet saying, I want to talk to the file server. So what ends up happening is it sends the packet, the KDC says, yes, now that we know who you are, you now have the authorization for it, and now we're going to send you to that system. So basically it goes to the whole portion of user authenticates, and then the TGS creates a new ticket session for the key, and then you're now communicating with the next device. But the whole process is you're communicating with the KDC the entire time until you finally get the pass off from your system to that system. So it's basically acting as a gateway or middleman to authenticate to make sure you are who you are. Okay, issues pertaining to Kerberos. Now the characteristics, its service provides authentication, confidentiality, and integrity. Non-availability or non-repudiation are not provided. What's a good example of non-repudiation? Yeah, email is probably one of the best examples of a service that does non-repudiation, is that whenever you send it, it can only be sent from your key, so you are validating that you did send it. So they can't come back and say that you didn't send it, or you can't come back and say you didn't send it. So the non-repudiation is basically proof that you did what you said you did, or you did what you said you didn't do. Okay, the KDC. This must be highly available and can be a single point of failure because it's the gateway. If it goes down, then you can no longer communicate with the rest of the assets. The secret and session key are stored on the user's workstation. Again, as far as the keys are concerned, it all comes down to the key storage medium. So if it's only on the workstation, if it's not protected in any other manner, then some way an attacker may grab that and then pretend that they're you. Kerberos is vulnerable to password guessing. Network traffic encryption can be enabled. And then all principals must have Kerberos software. And then must be understood ticketing and how technology works, which basically means that if you have a lot of items on there that are not able to communicate in the Kerberos realm, then basically you cannot use the Kerberos for the authentication. There's another thing with Kerberos that how many people here have heard of KerbSniff? It's a Linux utility. It basically allows you to sniff the traffic for Kerberos tickets, and then there's KerbCrack. So using those in combination, you can now sniff for Kerberos traffic and then try to crack the passwords and crack the traffic back and forth. So again, there's quite a few ways that if you have network access, that's the problem. A lot of the attacks, once you have one node on the network or once you're on the same subnet or whatnot, or on a Wi-Fi, because by default or de facto you're on the same network even if you're not authenticated or authorized, you can get the traffic and crack it. But you have to have geographic access basically when it comes down to it. Either potentially through VPN, but then you're still geographically there on the network. Okay, CISSP. Basically, it's a single sign-on technology. It's a secure European system for applications in a multi-vendor environment. This is based on asymmetric cryptography, not symmetric like Kerberos. It does not use tickets, but instead privileged attribute certificates, or PACs. CISSP was developed to address some of the issues in Kerberos. It is vulnerable to password guessing, however, same as Kerberos. Same thing with CISSP. The individual user communicates with the authentication service or the one system, and then once the authentication goes through, it goes to another server, which could technically be the same server, which is going to be the privileged attribute service. So it's authenticated to communicate further with print server, and then it's authenticated to be on the network, and then it's authenticated or authorized from the privilege or the PAC to communicate with it, and then goes forward. So basically there's 2 points of failure in that area. Okay, access control techniques. There's access control models. Once security goals are understood, a model must be chosen, basically fulfill the directives of the security policy. In real life, when it comes down to it, everything that you put in there, countermeasures, anything that you do technology-wise, needs to conform to the security policy. So if you go above and beyond that on a technicality, that's usually a bad thing. So you always want to make sure that, and the security policy is going to be based off the business goals, which should be based off the basically laws and regulations and items like that, and then how they want to make money or how they want to live as an entity. So with that being said, there are certain things that you may or may not be able to do within this type of environment that may be outside or inside the security policy, and you want to make sure that everything that you do stays inside the security policy. Okay, the model types. These you have to memorize. Discretionary access control, or DAC. There's mandatory access control, which is MAC. And there's role-based access control, which is RBAC. Also, non-discretionary access control. But again, what level of the TSEC is MAC going to be leveled at? B1, B2, B3, and then A. But it starts at B1. Characteristics of DAC. This is where the operating systems and applications use this model. Basically, it's integrated into the kernel of the operating system. This is where the owner of the resource has the discretion to determine which subjects can access it. What would be a good example of that?
2003.
Yeah, basically you have it to where you create a file as, say, power user, and you say that you want only a specific group, not guests, or administrators will probably still be able to use it, but everybody outside of your specific group will not be able to access it except one. So basically, yeah, you make sure that on NT systems, NTFS gives you that capability with the security features. Okay, owner of the resource has the discretion to determine which subjects can access it. Also, subjects can pass access permissions onto other subjects. Owner is usually the creator and has full control of the resource. So again, if you're the power user, you're going to have the full control over it, but you can say that there's a customized user called backup for SQL Server, and they'll be able to access the item that you created. It also uses identity-based controls and less secure than mandatory access control.